Fifth. All right, I want to welcome you to our fifth talk of the day. Today's talk will be presented by Dr. Keith Korcz. We got to engage with Dr. Korcz just a little bit to understand that he teaches philosophy here. He has been at the university since 1998. I kind of missed some of the conversation that he had with Dr. Perkins, but I know that he's attended the Ohio State and also Arizona State, as he and Dr. Perkins converse about Arizona, University of Arizona, Arizona State. And he mentioned a couple of other things, but teaching Philosophy 201, a critical thinking class here at the university is one that he mentioned. And so looking forward to hearing more about you, Dr. Korcz. And the topic that Dr. Korcz is going to present to us today is fake news in the real world, some tips on how to detect fake news. So get real with us, Dr. Korcz.
All right.
All right.
Thank you very much for inviting me. This is kind of an interesting topic. It's a new topic I recently added to my course. I mean, fake news historically, of course, has been around for, well, I think it began probably within 20 seconds of when people learned how to speak. And it's just kind of gone from there. But it's become a really important issue because of the changes in technology. I mean, in a democracy, you've got to have informed people. And if they're misinformed, it's pretty easy to manipulate what goes on in a democracy. The term fake news is used for a lot of different things. Sometimes it's used to label real news by people who don't like that real news. Other times it's used to talk about whatever people don't like. But for our purposes anyway, my purposes, fake news consists of fabricated news stories that are presented as being from legitimate sources and promoted in order to deceive and provoke a reaction from the public and for ideological or financial gain, okay? And so they tend to imitate real news without quite being real news. And the reactions that it's trying to get can be various. It can be as humble as trying to gain a click, to gain advertising dollars or a like. Could be for the purposes of swaying a vote in an election or referendum. Could be to boycott a product. Could be to manipulate the price of a company's stock. Could be to get people to participate in a political protest, or it could be, excuse me, just to create chaos. Some people just seem to enjoy that, apparently. So, for example, I'll give you a story here of someone who claims to be have produced quite a bit of fake news. This individual created a fake pro-Donald Trump news source during the 2016 election. He claimed he was making $10,000 per month from Google AdSense from his fake stories. And he says, quote, "My sites were picked up by Trump supporters all the time. I think Trump is in the White House because of me. His followers don't fact check anything. They'll post everything, believe anything. His campaign manager posted my story about a protester getting paid $3,500 as fact. Like, I made that up. I posted a fake ad on Craigslist." The author claims he was actually trying to undermine Trump. He says, quote, "I thought they'd fact check it. It'd make them look worse. I mean, that's how this always works. Somebody posts something I write, then they find out it's false and they look like idiots. But Trump supporters, they just keep running with it," end quote. Right. Now, of course, it's possible that was fake news. You never know. But it gives, maybe if correct, some insight into how effective this can be for some people, right? And of course, you know, the people that purvey fake news know they're not going to convince everybody, but they don't need to achieve their goals as a rule, right? Fake news that goes viral tends to evoke strong feelings, uses simple and persuasive language, is intended to be shocking, uses dramatic imagery, and imitates legitimate news sites, right? So it's distinct from biased news. In biased news, you have essentially correct stories where things are slanted in a particular way. Points in the story that highlight a particular point of view are, well, emphasized, right? And points contrary to the narrative the author wants to create are ignored. A great way to view this without having to run all over the internet is to look at a website called allsides.com, spelled ALLSIDES.com. And what they do is they take news stories from liberal sources and news stories from conservative sources and put them side by side. So you can compare how they tend to slant stories. And it's really a fascinating process. Another example was happened in Lafayette quite recently with a talk that was being given by a history professor that got canceled at the public library. And if you compare what the Fox News source said about it, the story is no longer up there, unfortunately. What Fox News said about it, as opposed to say what the Advocate said about it, it was just a stunning difference, right? According to one of them, they're trying to prevent politicizing the library, and according to the other story, a bunch of racists were attacking this person, right? About as biased as you can get, one way or the other, you know? So, next question, why do people believe fake news? I mean, for a lot of us, it'll just seem obvious that it's fake. At least us old folks, we're kind of used to a certain narrative. The research on this is pretty limited, but it's really gaining steam in the last decade or so. So you want to take this with a grain of salt, but here's what some studies have found. One survey found that while 84% of Americans are very confident or somewhat confident that they can detect fake news, studies show that roughly 70 to 80%, a similar percentage, believed many fake news headlines. There may be some Dunning-Kruger effect going on here. If you're not familiar with that, the Dunning-Kruger effect is supposed to be, it's fairly new, limited research on it, but it's supposed to be that people who are less competent tend to be more confident in what they believe because they're too incompetent to recognize their own incompetence. Yeah, I think we've all met people like this. So personal factors that correlate with believing fake news include things like confirmation bias. Now, confirmation bias is where it's a natural tendency. And the fact is, whether we like it or not, we all have it. I mean, I've been teaching this stuff forever. I still can catch myself doing this sometimes. Confirmation bias involves, is an unconscious process. It involves looking for and recognizing only the evidence that supports what you already believe and disregarding evidence contrary to what you believe. Very common, and especially for political and ideological beliefs. And that tends to encourage people to believe fake news that corresponds with their ideological viewpoint. Another factor studies have shown is a declining trust in mass media, such as TV and newspapers. I mean, it used to be the case back in the day when I was a boy. I'm so happy I'm getting old enough to use that phrase. There wasn't cable, right? There were basically 4 or 5 news stations. You had ABC, NBC, CBS, PBS, and maybe a local station that ran old TV shows like Gilligan's Island and Get Smart and stuff like that, right? That was it. Everybody in terms of news is basically on the same page because you have the same sources of news, right? That changed with the rise of the internet. It changed with the rise of cable, I guess, was really the first thing. It used to be the case they had what was called the Fairness Doctrine. Fairness Doctrine was a law that said that if you present one viewpoint, you have to present a differing viewpoint on certain sorts of political issues. And this is what news stations did. That got done away with in the 1980s. And that made possible stations that give you nothing but one particular viewpoint, which tends to isolate viewers. Anyway, while around 70% of Americans say they trusted mass media in the 1970s, that figure declined to 32% in 2016. The figures vary by political party, interestingly enough. 73% of Democrats say they trust the media a great deal or a fair amount, whereas 89% of Republicans say they trust the media not very much or none at all. The result is people are kind of living in different worlds, right? There's not as much commonality between the two as you might hope. Other common factors associated with accepting and sharing fake news include things like being closed-minded, using automatic rather than analytic thinking, lower levels of education and cognitive ability. Fake news generally requires less effort and attention being more easy and fun to watch than real news. And this attracts a certain segment of people. It attracts everybody a little bit if you like fun, but still. In addition, mere repetition of a claim where the truth of the claim is unknown tends to make it seem more plausible because apparently it's easier for the brain to process, right? So for example, one psychological experiment on this, people were shown a fake headline that said that President Donald Trump was going to ban all TV shows that promote gay activity. 5% believed it. Later, when the same headline was repeated, 10% believed it. Sometimes mere repetition can increase or confirm belief. The nature of fake news tends to trigger automatic thinking. And automatic thinking is kind of thinking that's kind of effortless, easy, gullible. Kahneman and Tversky, if you're familiar with their work, call it System 1. And it's just how we ordinarily think, frankly, right? You have to force yourself to use System 2 to be a little more careful in your reasoning. Fake news tends to trigger System 1 thinking, right? So it tends to bypass careful thought, tends to seem more plausible to people than the results of analytic thinking. And this is why, in part, social media posts tend to be short, written in simple language, easy to read, often posted by friends, repeatedly shared and commented on, tend to reflect your own values because they track what you click on and try to give you more of it. You wind up isolating yourself. Okay, so why is fake news a problem? Well, the internet has greatly lowered the cost of disseminating fake news. Used to be the case that if you wanted to disseminate fake news, you better get a printing press or your own cable news station, otherwise you're pretty much out of luck, right? There's a very limited audience you could practically reach. Now, anybody with a computer and an internet connection anywhere in the world can reach millions of people at virtually no cost. So it's been estimated, well, in fact, you can also use bots. These don't have to be run around by people. Bots are basically internet robots that will repeat stories. They can even sometimes create stories. It's been estimated that about 9 to 15% of active Twitter accounts are bots. Facebook has an estimated over 60 million bots infesting their network. And these can allow one person to do the work of, hundreds of people. In fact, one study found that 0.1% of Twitter users were responsible for 80% of the sharing from fake news sources. In a lot of cases, it's a relatively small number of people that are producing massive amounts of fake news. And a lot of people get their news from social media. Most adults in the US say they sometimes or often get their news from social media, such as Facebook, YouTube, and Twitter. Which interestingly, my research I've discovered, you put these together and you get twit face, which is indicative of the fake news they tend to send around. None of these sources edit news for accuracy or information for accuracy, right? So for example, in the first 3 months leading up to the 2016 presidential election, the top 20 fake news stories on Facebook, 17 of which were pro-Trump or anti-Clinton, received more shares, reactions, and comments, 8.7 million, than the top 20 real news stories, which received about 7.4 million, right? It's estimated that fake stories favoring Trump were shared about 30 million times on Facebook, whereas those favoring Clinton were shared about 8 million times. Okay. Fake news has resulted in boycotts of major companies. So for example, McDonald's for allegedly, and now this is a story, this is an interesting example of how stories get recycled. This was a story that was going around back in the 80s, right? When I was in high school. People boycotted recently in 2014, McDonald's for allegedly using worms to make their hamburgers, worm burgers, right? Pepsi got boycotted for their CEO allegedly bad-mouthing Trump supporters, which he didn't do. Starbucks in 2017 for allegedly offering discounts of 40% off to undocumented immigrants, and so on, right? People are just being flat out manipulated here. One of the scariest of these was a story called Pizzagate, which you might have heard of. This happened in 2016. where Hillary Clinton and other top Democrats were accused of running a child sex ring involving satanic rituals out of a pizza parlor in Washington, D.C. The story was promoted by right-wing pundits such as Alec Jones. By the end of 2016, believed to be definitely or probably true by 24% of Democrats and 49% of Republicans. That's a lot of market penetration, right? The results of that fake news included hundreds of death threats aimed at the pizza parlor's workers, an attempt to set the pizza parlor on fire, and one guy entered the restaurant with an assault rifle, firing it to open a locked door in an effort to save the children. He wound up getting sentenced to 4 years in prison for that. So, I mean, people are really acting on this stuff, and it can be a little scary sometimes. Another example is the QAnon conspiracy theory, according to which the government, media, and financial worlds in the US are controlled by a group of Satan-worshiping pedophiles who run a child sex trafficking operation, that there's a storm coming soon that will sweep away those elites, and that violence may be needed to save the country. That was believed by 14% of all Americans, including 23% of Republicans, 7% of Democrats, right? Pretty wild. But again, you don't need a large number of people to have a significant, to believe things like this, to have a huge effect on society, right? These are stories that pretty much everybody's heard about, or some of them, right? So how do you spot and avoid fake news? Well, the best thing to do is stick with reliable kind of mainstream news sources. One of the best is, for example, Associated Press. Another is Reuters. Those aren't particular news stations. They are what are called news services, which create stories, discover stories, find stories, people file stories with them, and then news services who subscribe can use those stories in their own news broadcast and modify them as they see fit. And so they have a financial incentive to be as neutral as possible when presenting stories, because they want as many clients as possible from all sides of the political spectrum. That's one thing to look for anytime you're dealing with fake news. Follow the money, right? But how to spot and avoid fake news? Perhaps you're on a site, you're not sure if it's real or not, but it's kind of important to you. They're talking about some important issues. Here's a 3-step process. First step is the smell test, right? These are things that are relatively easy to check, right? If the headline is written in all capital letters, that's a warning sign. If it includes lots of exclamation points in it, that's a warning sign. They're trying to dramatize things that probably over-dramatize them. If the text has many misspellings or grammatical errors, that's a warning sign. If the URL for the article is subtly different from a legitimate site, right? Instead of abcnews.com, it's abcnews.co.com. There's a good chance that's a fake website. Sometimes articles will identify themselves as ads, right? They'll say sponsored content or paid post, but they're designed to look like news articles. So you've got to read the fine print. Sometimes the article is old. News sources are getting recycled. Assertions are made without citing any named source or providing any plausible line of reasoning. That's a warning sign. The article contains innuendo, personal attacks, other fallacies, errors in reasoning. That's a warning sign. And these are all things that just looking at a site, you can detect pretty quickly, okay? What most people do as a second step here would be to take a closer look at the website. But it turns out that what fact checkers do is our second step, which is called lateral verification, okay? What they do is they glance at the headlines of an article, they quickly read through the first couple of paragraphs, then they go to websites that they know are trustworthy, Associated Press or something like that, and see if they're reporting the same thing. If you have a story, it's more than a couple hours old, and it's fairly dramatic or important, it should be on all the major news networks within a couple of hours. If it's only on one or two and not the rest, that's a warning sign that something may be up. Avoid partisan sites. If you look at a website like mediabiasfactcheck.com, that's just how it's spelled, mediabiasfactcheck.com. they'll identify sites in terms of how liberal or conservative they are. And they'll give kind of a ranking. And that can give you some insight as to where a website is coming from. One strategy here is to look what the super conservative websites are saying, look what the super liberal websites are saying. If they're both agreeing on something, that's a little safer than just going by one or the other alone. You can also check reliable fact-checking websites, right? Snopes.com is pretty good. It's a pretty famous one. Factcheck.org, politifact.com. They can tell you if a particular story has been, verified or not in some cases. Okay, so that's step 2, lateral verification. Third step is the deep dive. Okay, this involves evaluating what a website says about itself. And sometimes that can be surprisingly useful. So check the website's About Us page. Virtually every website has an About Us page. And it may tell you things about the page that weren't obvious to you, right? It may tell you it's a satire news site. Some fake news is generated by people sharing, news stories from places like The Onion that advertise itself as a satire website, and people wind up believing them, right? That can be useful. Of course, the information there can be faked by the authors of the website. As it turns out, generators of fake news tend to be lazy, and so they don't bother to do that very well. If the About Us page has nothing on it, that's a warning sign. If the article has images, studies have shown that if you have an image attached to a news article, even if the image is completely unrelated to the news article, it tends to make it seem more credible. What you can do is you can research images, right, on sites like tineye.com, and search for the image and see if there's an original, see if it's been altered in any way. And that can give you some information about, whether the site's legit or not. Read the sources cited by the author. I've gone through certain things on certain websites, and it'll look legit. They'll cite, 40 or 50 different sources. You go and look at what the sources are saying, and it turns out that the person citing them left out words like "not" in the quote and things like that, right? So the author says, it is not the case that da-da-da-da-da-da, and they're quoted as saying, it is the case that da-da-da-da-da-da. That can be useful as well. You can also check out who's funding a site sometimes. And again, one site that tries to track these things down is a site called MediaBiasFactCheck.com that I mentioned before. They try to determine who's funding a site, and that can give you an indication of whether or not there might be ulterior motives here, right? For example, pharmaceutical manufacturers may create a website dealing with a particular illness that they're selling a drug for. The site might be arthritis.com, and you think, oh, that sounds like, a pretty, well-established site, because it looks like it came up early in the, the URL auctions. And it turns out it's being run by a pharmaceutical company that's essentially using this site to sell its pharmaceuticals to people, right? You want to be careful about that, okay? What not to do. I've told my students so many times, and they don't want to believe me. Google is not how you do research, okay? The order of results that come up in Google is absolutely no indication whatsoever of their reliability. People think they are, they're not. They have various algorithms that they use that have nothing to do with reliability. They're trying to get clicks for ads primarily. Don't do that. If you're going to do real research, you're going to do college level research, right? I mean, use the Dupre Library databases, EBSCOhost, things like that. You want to use peer-reviewed journals, not made-up journals, or Newsweek or Time Magazine or some website somebody put up. Not the way to do it. Professional-looking page design tells you nothing. Clever icons and logos tell you nothing. Those are easily faked. People will just copy them from other sites sometimes and alter them slightly. Lots of charts, graphs, infographics, photos mean nothing. Okay, they don't tell you that the source is reliable or the information is accurate. So those are some things to avoid doing, to be careful of. And those are your 3 steps for checking fake news, right? You got your smell test, you've got your lateral verification, and you got your deep dive. If something survives all 3, it's probably more likely accurate than not. So I've been talking for a while. Do you guys have any thoughts or questions or anything of the sort?
Dr. Korcz, certainly truth is so very important. You certainly hit upon some things that are so salient, I think, to all of us. I mean, we want to know what's going on in the world, in our lives, what's true and what's not. And, really interesting information that you're sharing. And as you said, it's difficult sometimes to detect or tell what's fake and what's not. So I appreciate you giving us some ways of seeking to verify some authenticity of what it is that we're consuming. But really appreciate your information. Thank you very much.
You. Happy to do so. Happy to do so. Yeah.
See, Dr. Perkins has his hand up.
Okay.
I don't know. That might be, is that your hand, Dr. Perkins? I'm not sure.
It's a version. Yeah, it's a University of Arizona hand. So not as good as the Arizona State version of it.
Well.
But what are you gonna do? Yeah, it's a very timely topic. And of course, there's a lot of questions that I have, from a psychological angle on this. But first, like in terms of like the reliable sources that you sort of mentioned, it seems to me that it's in the interest for those who like chaos, or for whatever reason like to undermine us having access to reliable information, that this does seem to be in some circles a direct attack on those very sources, like campaigns to discredit Snopes, campaigns to discredit fact check, AP, Reuters, under like this broad umbrella of mainstream media, which they are creating this sort of equivalence to mainstream media equals liars. And what you have any thoughts, or is there any indications about what can be done to combat that? Because if you have a person who is trying to use the methods that you were talking about, but they are listening really, really hard to those who are undermining those very sources that you are talking about to center our search for facts, what's the next step for those who are trying to promote accurate information?
Yeah, that's a really interesting question, and it reminds me of this metaphor that was used in another context by Otto Neurath in the earlier part of the century. You kind of have to build your boat at sea, right? You can't go into a dock where you're certain you've got correct information and start building from there. You have to start with what you've got, and if what you've got is corrupt, it can be very difficult to get to something plausible, right? If the data that you've got is corrupt. And so, they do this a lot, and I think part of this goes back to what the tobacco companies were doing, where they're trying to undermine legitimate science, right? Back in the 60s, in order to preserve their profits, right? Maybe one thing you can do, again, one kind of it's a difficult question. One thing you can do is, again, try to follow the money, so to speak, right? People that are pushing fake information have a relatively small number of motives. So they want to make money. They want to push some sort of ideology, ideological belief. They want to just create chaos. The chaotic evil ones, you might call them, are pretty outrageous, and they're pretty sloppy, right? You can kind of tell if they're talking about, pedophile rings with Hillary Clinton. Use some common sense. Hillary Clinton during a presidential campaign, anybody during a presidential campaign is being followed around by dozens of reporters, pretty much 24/7. There's not a lot they're going to get away with. Use some common sense there. That tends to take care of the chaotic, evil individuals. When they're trying to make money, look at who's funding them, look at who tends to benefit financially, right? If you see a policy proposed that is primarily going to benefit oil companies, there's a chance that if you go digging, you're going to find funding from oil companies, right? This was the whole climate change thing. You start digging into the resources behind these individuals and alleged groups that are supporting climate denial, you find funding from oil companies. For ideological interest, you tend to find that everything they say, or most of what they say, lines up with their ideology. And that's always a coincidence, right? A little too coincidental to be trusted. No ideology is perfect. Every ideology makes mistakes. Every ideology will get misinterpreted by somebody or in some way for some purpose. If you have consistency in ideology, that's a warning sign, right? It should, in an accurate news source, it's going to be all over the place. There are going to be things that conservatives like. There are going to be things that liberals like. There are going to be things that conservatives hate. There are going to be things that liberals hate. That's just the way it is, right? Ironically, unfortunately, I've seen some research in psychology, and psychologists would know more than me about this, but that shows that the types of sources that people find the most unreliable tend to be the sources that present both sides equally, right? I guess it's somebody to piss off everybody. So that's one thing you can look for. So some blend of common sense, look at the motives, follow the money, is probably your best bet to try to come up with something stable, some sort of stable, correct account. By the way, if you like, I mean, I can, sometimes people think truth is this kind of nebulous, out of nowhere concept, but it's a pretty straightforward concept, right? The way philosophers tend to understand it is that a statement is true if it matches up with the way things are, right? So if I say, you know, this is a pen, what I'm saying is true just in case this is a pen, right? And so what's true depends on the way the world is, not what you or I believe. And that's the case with news as well, right? You're believing something, or you're wanting to believe something, doesn't make it true. You know this because sooner or later you run into reality, right? I mean, how do we know that truth is objective like this? Well, you know, it isn't a matter of what most people say. At one point, most people in the world thought the earth was flat, right? Well, if you know, most people believing something made it true, then at that time, the earth would have really been flat. If the earth was really flat, nobody could have possibly discovered that it was a sphere, right? They would have fallen off the edge. So you can actually show that truth isn't subjective like that. There are objective truths, and it's valuable to be in contact with them. Well, any other thoughts, or Jesse? I don't know how do I pick people who have their hands up here?
I got it.
Okay.
Yeah. So a statement and a question. Yeah, it's interesting you mentioned truth. I mean, this is probably in bad taste, but was at a Zoom talk, sort of mainly from the English department, and the first 30 minutes were spent just sort of asserting how there's no such thing as truth. And I think it's interesting how, you know, this has become something that sort of started, we might say, on the left with postmodernism, and now on the right as well. We have sort of both sides denying that there's anything like truth. That's just sorry if that was an odd. I just want to corroborate that there's reason for you to talk about correspondence, yeah. You know, theory of truth.
Did you ask them if what they were saying is true?
I was saying that. Yeah. Low head for this one. But my question is, I mean, the problem that I've seen is, so, you know, I had a student come to my office once and say, hey, do you know what's going on in South Africa? And I'm like, yeah, I'm not going to tell him no. You know, I assume something's going on in South Africa, right? So he tells me how there's genocide against white farmers. You know, this is maybe five or 6 years ago. And so this is around the time in the class when, as a quick side note, someone came on Tucker Carlson, and then Trump ended up tweeting about this fake thing going on, right? But so anyway, the point is, I was talking about confirmation bias and falsifiability, and so I asked my students, to take something, to take something and try to falsify it. And I've never had a student once do what I asked. Every single time they just go and they find something that verifies or corroborates, their beliefs. And so I wonder, with all the, years and students you've taught, I mean, is there anything that you've found that works to get people to actually sort of partake in exploratory reasoning or want to find the truth? Because to me, it seems like, we've evolved with motivated reasoning, and the internet's just this great candy land of things that people get to grab onto. And the problem, I'm sure, is in part identifying it, but I think probably a greater problem is just the lack of a desire to find truth. Have you found any successful methods to motivate people to care to find accuracy in the first place?
Yeah, basically you have to grab them by the neck and drag them kicking and screaming to it. It's about, so to give you an example, I used to got this assignment, right, where it's an appeals to experts argument, right? And they're supposed to go and see what the consensus of experts is on some issue, right? And so I want them to do it. I didn't want it to be a big deal, so I give it as extra credit. All the people that need it don't do it, right? So, okay, I come up with an idea. This is required extra credit. If you do it, you get extra credit. If you don't do it, you fail the course. Okay, that gets everybody doing it, right? Once they get the idea, they have to complete the assignment. Sometimes they complain about it, but eventually they realize that it does nothing but benefit them. As long as they complete the assignment, it can only help the grade, it can't hurt it. It's actually better than making it a regular assignment for them. Okay, so I do that. Well, what do? They look up the first thing that comes up on Google, right? And they try to give me that as a source, right? And those sources, I think, sometimes are manipulated, because they were using this source that is about as sleazy as you can get in this literature that I was familiar with. And so I tell them over and over, don't use Google, don't use Google, don't use Google. Next, what do? Well, 3/4 of them use Google, right? And they think I'm not going to know, right? And so eventually I said, okay, you have to use a library database that has professional journals in it. And you have to print out the page, the search engine that shows me that you use that, right? So they go and do that. And so you kind of have to take them by the hand and step by step make them do what they need to do, because I think part of it is they don't know what to do. Even if you tell them numerous times, it doesn't stick sometimes. And then they feel they don't have the time to do it. That I sympathize with, right? As y'all know, most of our students are probably working 30, 40 hours a week in addition to try to go to school. And it's this difficult situation. On the one hand, you want to help them out. On the other hand, they need to learn stuff. Otherwise, they're wasting their time here, right? So I just kind of, get to the point where you make them do what they're supposed to do until they get the idea. That's the best I've come up with. Rick.
I had a question, and first off, Jesse, you were mentioning an English talk. You're talking about the one earlier today?
Oh no, this was a few weeks ago.
Okay. I just wanted to make sure, because the topic of truth came up earlier today, but it not in the way that you mentioned. But if it's a different talk, then I have nothing.
This was
comment on that.
Yeah,
I do. Yeah, thank you. Yeah, interesting topic, interesting question, and interesting sort of information. I do think that one of the things that's a sort of an inherent challenge in this sort of truth kind of thing is that has to do with how language works and the way that we communicate, because the grammatical structure of an opinion-based statement and that is by definition an opinion, and the grammatical structure of a statement that is clearly fact-based are the same. So then water is a liquid. You can use that to say same grammatical structure of Van Halen is the best rock and roll band that ever existed. One is I would posit that one is a fact, and the other is something that might be
Careful
true.
Now.
But it all depends. Like that the fact might be 67% of surveyed people believe that the Beatles were, you know, whatever, would be more of a fact. But we don't get a lot of, I don't think that we get a lot of guidance in really being able to tell what is opinion and what is fact, because there are a lot of reasonable opinions that I agree with that are not fact-based sort of statements. And I think there's a lot of blurring of the lines in the media between what's a fact and what's, you know, sort of opinion.
Yeah. One thing that sometimes helps is that the logical structure is distinct from the grammatical structure sometimes. And that can tell you if you have a line of reasoning or just a statement that's floating around out there. And that can be useful. Critical thinking courses are good for that. Symbolic logic is fantastic for that. Although it can be a brutally difficult course, you take this course and it's very math-like. And I'd say it's the most valuable course I ever took as an undergraduate. It changes the way you think if you really get into it and you start noticing the logical structure of, if any, in paragraphs and things like that. And also a lot of it is precision in terms, I think. If you're careful about what it is you're saying and exactly what you mean, and you can clarify that enough, a lot of times becomes clear exactly what is this an opinion? Is this a fact? Is this what? Yeah. But you're exactly right. The grammar, and this was a huge part of the first half of 20th century philosophy. Grammar and language is incredibly deceptive. And to the point that a lot of philosophers early on, they called the logical positivists, thought that if we could just get clear about what the hell we're saying, all philosophical problems would disappear. Well, that turned out to be a little, optimistic, but there's a lot of truth to it.
Very fascinating, interesting information. By the way, related to the Earth, there's even a biblical reference many hundreds of years prior to the actual discovery of the Earth being round. Indications of that in Scripture. Of course, folks may debate some aspects of that as well, but really fascinating information that you've shared. A number of students, as you've seen, have maybe checked out, but they were indicating how relevant this topic is. So beautiful. Thank you so much for the information. We still have some time left. Anyone with any Dr. Korcz, you may have something you want to say. Anyone has a question or further comment?
Oh, no.
I think Jesse has. By the way, Dr. Perkins had up, that was a fake wave and fake pat on the back, Dr. Korcz. I just want you to know that. Okay.
If someone else has something else, I already made it. I mean, I have so much to say, but if anyone else wants to chime in first.
Yes. Anybody else who hasn't spoken yet?
Yeah. You mentioned it works out great, with students. You mentioned sort of having the opportunity to make them want, or to force them, right, to try to find truth and not just confirm their views. It seems like if we could somehow foster epistemic norms that rewarded good thinking or good sources, it seems like, it's easier than ever these days. People can just sort of make claims, and it's simply enough to just state them. And it seems like if we had epistemic norms where we really valued, a different approach, but it just seems difficult. I don't know. I'm sort of despondent when it comes to the sort of prospects of people being motivated enough to actually try to find the truth, because it's like, this concept rational irrationality. I mean, so I think for a lot of people we know, it just makes sense for them to, I mean, we're rewarded in life for agreeing with people around us or who are posting something that we're friends with. We're not really rewarded in life for
just jumping on like that, feeling discouraged and like getting on board with that sentiment. What a depressing thing to get on board with, right? But this is one of the reasons why I've been engaging in discourse less and less on social media because it gets really depressing sometimes. What really depressed me isn't that people make misstatements. I have caught myself making misstatements as well. There's been a couple times where I got fished in by fake news and I posted something in outrage and somebody like pointed out, I think that's a satire site. And I was so embarrassed and I immediately took it off, my page. What's discouraging is when you present a cogent, what I think is relatively overwhelming facts to somebody indicating that something that they just posted was not true, and that the response is yes. I would kind of wondered about whether that was true or not, but the point still remains, so I'm going to keep it up there. I just think that everybody should have all sides. That to me is more discouraging than the fact that people post things that are fake, but that they'll actually admit this is probably fake, and then they'll have an argument for, but I still think that people need to see this. Makes me sad.
Yeah. I mean, going back to what Jesse said, you're so right. It would be better if in our society, we, disagreeing with someone is equated with being impolite, right? Instead of being fun, which is what it should be, right? And what it usually often is sometimes, right? You get to debate something, or you get to learn something. And I think there's room to, try to alter cultural norms in such a way that they express epistemic virtues, such as being humble, realizing that, you're going to make mistakes, being comfortable with that, being open to new evidence and being willing to disagree with each other and in hopes of learning something. That's so much fun. It shouldn't be considered impolite, but what can you do? It'd be nice if there were like a TV show or something that demonstrated that ethos, right? That's just like a different society, right? You don't have that. They always reflect what we've got rather than what we should have. A lot of times, it seems.
Dr. Korcz, one approach that I think has been successful, and again, this is an arena that maybe other people differ on, is individuals who were opposed to whatever it is they eventually espoused. For example, some books I've read, Evidence That Demands a Verdict by Josh McDowell and Lee Strobel, and some other evidences related to things that are sort of faith-based, but also individuals who were vehemently opposed to what it is that they adopted, and also individuals who might die for something that they believed, or at one point was willing to deny out of fear, but based on courage and based upon evidence that demanded some kind of action, proceeded and lost lives because of it sometimes. And that's not always the case, but I'm thinking related to some of the aspects of what I consider biblical truth, even though that's an area that maybe in academic circles may be highly debated.
I have a reaction a little bit, which is those are going to be very interesting to see people whose views have changed over time or who have progressed. But of course, like psychologically, there's also something that we also want to keep in mind, is that cognitive dissonance would predict that if we change that sometimes people who change their mind are going to be the people who are the strongest for their new perspective, because it helps them to sort of feel better, to feel stronger about the change that they made. It's like, if you have conflicting cognitions, you end up, really justifying the cognitions that you have. But I think that what you're talking about is definitely in the spirit of getting information from different sources, not from one source, looking at, different ways of expressing things.
Really interesting, Patrick. You mentioned that. I mean, because I one of that when Keith, when you mentioned epistemic virtues, I started to type in the chat, being proud of changing one's mind on something, right? And this is interesting, Patrick, because you're right. Does seem like, and this is a case when people change one's mind. When someone changes one's mind, it seems to give something like credibility to to the new view. So this I'm thinking maybe there is something in us that does appreciate when other people change their minds. Maybe it's just hard for us to do. I'm not sure. That's interesting.
Yeah. Well, I think sometimes what can happen is that people different views become, or ideologies or what have you, become part of someone's identity. And once you do that, disagreeing with the view is an attack on them. There is no distinction between the two, right? And I think it'd be better if the identity part was more abstract, not tied to particular doctrine so much, but tied to maybe an interest in discovering truths, right? And this surprises people so much. I mean, I had a discussion recently with some students, and I was telling them about what you went through to get a PhD, right? They have no idea what a PhD is for the most part, right? And so I'm telling you, I did my dissertation on a topic, and I spent a good part of my dissertation arguing that my dissertation advisor's view on this topic that he'd published on was completely wrong and should be replaced with my view, right? And students are surprised by that. And I'm surprised by their surprise because at the time, right, there was never the slightest worry that there would be anybody would be offended, anybody would be annoyed. It was go for it, do it, right? Do your best, right? And let's work it out. And I like my way better. I think it's a lot more fun, One of the philosophers I have an enormous amount of respect for example, was a guy named Lawrence Bonger, who for years brilliantly defended a view in theory and knowledge called coherentism, then decided he was wrong and published an article saying, yeah, I was all wrong about that. And here's the problem with my view, right? And he completely changed his view. I thought that was like one of the most awesome things ever, right? Because he had been defending this view for over a decade, right? And in books and in articles, and he's a brilliant philosopher, done it so well, and said, no, I'm wrong about that, and just changed it. I thought that was just like the coolest thing ever. I really respect people like that.
I sort of see Wittgenstein in a similar way, some of the ways which he did round up, did major changes on fundamental positions over time. Although I hear he was like a handful.
He was a bit of a nut, right? He wrote the Tractatus, decided it solved all the problems of philosophy and went off to do something else. And then came back and said, well, maybe it doesn't solve all the problems of philosophy, and changed his views. Yeah, but at least that part is good,
So much appreciate the discourse. To be continued. Blessings to you all. We've got a talk that's scheduled for 4, but wish we could talk some more. We'll have to make arrangements to do that.
All right. Thank you for inviting me. It was a lot of fun.
Thank you.
I really enjoyed
Thank you
listening.
so much.
Great
Thanks.
one.
Man.
Bye.
Bye, everyone.
Bye.